All day the two men tended their cows. At night they went back to the tiny hut where they lived. They ate supper and worked in the garden and went to sleep. It was always the same. Then Thomas had an idea that changed everything. "Let's make a doll the size of a man," he said. "It would be fun to make, and we could put it in the garden to scare the birds." "It should look like Harold," Alfred said. Harold was a farmer they both hated. They made a doll out of old sacks stuffed with straw. They gave it a pointy nose like Harold's and tiny eyes like his. Then they added dark hair and a twisted frown, and of course they gave it Harold's name. Each morning on their way to the pasture, they tied Harold to a pole in the garden to scare away the birds. Each night they brought him inside so that he wouldn't get ruined if it rained. When they were feeling playful, they would talk to him. One of them might say, "How are the vegetables growing today, Harold?" Then the other, making believe he was Harold, would answer in a crazy voice, very slowly. They would both laugh, but not Harold. Whenever something went wrong, they took it out on Harold. They would curse at him, even kick or punch him. Sometimes one of them would take the food they were eating, which they both were sick of, and smeared it on the doll's face. "How do you like that stew, Harold?" he would ask. "Well, you better eat it or else." Then the two men would howl with laughter. One night, after Thomas had wiped Harold's face with food, Harold grunted. "Did you hear that?" Alfred asked. "It was Harold," Thomas said. "I was watching him when it happened. I can't believe it." "How could he grunt?" Alfred asked. "He's just a sack of straw. It's not possible." "Let's throw him in the fire," Thomas said, "and that will be that." "Let's not do anything stupid," said Alfred. "We don't know what's going on. When we move the cows down, we'll leave him behind. And for now, let's just keep an eye on him." So they left Harold sitting in the corner of the hut. They didn't talk to him or take him outside anymore. Now and then the dog grunted, but that was all. After a few days, they decided there was nothing to be afraid of. Maybe a mouse or some insects had gotten inside Harold and were making those sounds. So Thomas and Alfred went back to their old ways, and each morning they put Harold out in the garden, and each night they brought him back into the hut. And when they felt playful, they joked with him. When they felt mean, they treated him as badly as ever. Then one night, Alfred noticed something that frightened him. "Harold is growing," he said. "I was thinking the same thing," Thomas said. "Maybe it's just our imagination," Alfred replied. "We've been up here on this mountain for too long." The next morning, while they were eating, Harold stood up and walked out of the hut. He climbed up on the roof and trotted back and forth like a horse on its hind legs. All day and all night he trotted like that. In the morning, Harold climbed down and stood in a far corner of the pasture. The men had no idea what to do next. They were afraid. They decided to take the cows down into the valley that same day. When they left, Harold was nowhere in sight, and they felt as if they had escaped great danger and began joking and singing. But when they had gone only a mile or two, they realized they had forgotten to bring the milking stools. Neither one wanted to go back for them, but the stools would cost a lot to replace. "There really is nothing to be afraid of," they told one another. "After all, what could a doll do?" They drew straws to see which one would go back, and it was Thomas. "And I'll catch up with you," he said, and Alfred walked toward the valley. When Alfred came to a rise in the path, he looked back for Thomas. He didn't see him anywhere, but he did see Harold. The doll was on the roof of the hut again, and as Alfred watched, Harold kneeled and stretched out a bloody skin to dry in the sun. One day, a young married couple went hiking in the mountains, and as the sun began to set, they realized that they were lost. The wife was getting worried, but her husband tried to calm her down and assured her that they would eventually find their way back to their car. However, after walking for hours, they still had no idea where they were. It was growing dark, and the man and wife were getting desperate. They didn't have a map or a compass with them, and all the trees looked the same. Just when they were about to give up hope, they came across an old cabin in a clearing. The cabin looked as if it had seen better days. It was dilapidated and seemed like it hadn't been used in a long time. And some of the windows were cracked and broken, and a lot of the tiles had fallen off the roof. The husband knocked on the front door, but there was no response. When he turned the handle, it slowly creaked open. Inside, they found that it was in a bad state of disrepair. There was very little furniture, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. As the couple cautiously looked around, they noticed a strange atmosphere and a peculiar musty smell. The walls were covered from floor to ceiling with graffiti, and written in red paint the words, "Death," over and over again. And with a shaking hand, the husband reached out to touch the wall, and he was horrified to find that the paint was not yet dry. The couple was very frightened, but they didn't have anywhere else to go, and they knew that the mountain was dangerous at night and that there were a lot of wild animals prowling the woods. But despite the creepy writing on the walls, they decided to stay the night. Going upstairs, they found a moth-eaten mattress that was covered in stains. The husband and wife wrapped themselves in an old piece of carpet to keep warm, and they tried to make themselves as comfortable as possible under the circumstances. They lay down together on the mattress and eventually managed to fall asleep. Sometime after midnight, the couple were awakened by a strange rustling noise, and it sounded like someone or something was moving around outside the shack. "Did you hear that?" asked his wife. "I think there's somebody out there." Her husband listened for a while, but he didn't hear anything. So he got out of bed and walked over to the window, but it was too dark outside to see anything. So he opened the window and he stuck his head out. "Who's there?" he called nervously, but there was no answer. He was about to go back to bed when his wife said, "Maybe it's someone who can't speak." So the husband returned to the window and said, "Is there anybody out there?" Clapped once for yes and twice for no. He strained his ears to listen. The stars twinkled in the night sky and the crickets were chirping loudly. All of a sudden, he heard a loud. The man turned to his wife and said in surprise, "You were right, there's someone out there." So he leans out the window and his eyes scanned the darkness. He couldn't make out anything in the pitch black. So he asked, "Are you the owner of this cabin? Are you a man?" "You're a woman then." "Are you human?" A chill ran down his spine. He swallowed hard and croaked, "Did you come here alone?" "How many are with you?" Clap once for each person. A few years ago, there was a wealthy couple who had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and the family lived in a large house in Newport Beach, California. The mother and father decided that they needed a break, so they booked a table for dinner at a nice restaurant. That evening, they called a teenager they knew and arranged for her to come over and babysit their children while they were out. When the babysitter arrived, the parents told her to fix supper for the kids and to put them to bed. "And after that, you can just watch TV and help yourself to anything in the refrigerator," said the father. "And if you wouldn't mind," said the mother, "could you just watch TV in our bedroom? The kids have been having nightmares recently, so if you hear them crying, you can just go in and calm them down." The babysitter happily agreed, and the parents left for their dinner date. So the girl gave the children some milk and cookies, then she ushered them upstairs to bed. She started to read a bedtime story, and before long, the little boy and girl were fast asleep. After tucking them in, she switched off the lights and went to watch TV. And when the babysitter walked into the parents' bedroom and she sat down, she noticed that there was a creepy-looking clown statue standing in the corner of the room. She tried to ignore it, but it looked so eerie and disturbing that it sent a chill down her spine. She felt as though its eyes were staring straight at her while she watched TV. And as time passed, the babysitter started to feel more and more uneasy about the clown statue. Whenever she glanced at it, she got the unsettling feeling that it moved ever so slightly. And finally, the clown statue began to freak her out so much that she couldn't handle it any longer. So she decided to call the parents. And when she dialed the number they left for her, the mother answered. The babysitter said, "Hi, it's me. Everything's fine. The kids are fast asleep in bed, but I was just wondering, would it be okay if I watch TV downstairs?" "Of course," replied the father, "but why?" "I know it sounds silly," laughed the girl, "but the clown statue is really creeping me out." "The clown statue?" asked the father. "Yeah, the clown statue in your bedroom," the girl replied. The phone went silent for a moment. "Listen to me carefully," said the father. "Take the children and get out of the house. We'll call the police." "What's wrong?" asked the girl. The father gulped and replied, "We don't have a clown statue." For a second, the babysitter just stood there stunned. Then she dropped the phone and raced upstairs and grabbed the children. Carrying one under each arm, she raced downstairs again and fled out into the street. And huddled on the sidewalk, comforting the two children, the babysitter looked up at the bedroom window and saw something that made her scream out in horror. Peeking through the curtains was the white painted face of a clown. It stared at her for a moment, then it sank back down into darkness. Within minutes, the police arrived and cautiously entered the house. In the upstairs bedroom, they found a man dressed in a clown suit. When they arrested him, they found a knife concealed in his costume. The clown turned out to be a mentally disturbed man who was a convicted murderer. He had been stalking this family for months, lurking in their attic during the daytime and coming out to sneak around the house at night. And for weeks, the children had been complaining about a clown statue that stood in their room and watched them sleep. But the parents just dismissed this as nightmares. A 15-year-old girl named Donna lived with her father in a small house in the suburbs. Ever since her mother died, Donna had depended on her father for everything. They had a wonderful relationship and loved each other very much. One morning, Donna's father was leaving on a business trip. As they ate breakfast together, he told her that he would be home very late that night. And with that, he kissed her on the forehead, grabbed his briefcase, and walked out the front door. Later that day, when Donna came home from school, she did some homework and watched some TV. By midnight, her father still hadn't returned, so she decided to go to bed. That night, she had a dream. She found herself standing at the edge of a busy highway. Cars and trucks whizzed by at an alarming rate. She looked across the highway and saw a familiar figure standing on the other side. It was her father. His hands were cupped around his mouth, and he seemed to be shouting something to her, but she couldn't make out what he was saying. And as the traffic whizzed by, she strained to hear. Her father's eyes were sad. He seemed to be desperately trying to communicate something to her. She could barely make out the words. "Don't open door." Suddenly, a strange tapping sound woke Donna up. Then somebody began to ring the doorbell downstairs. She scrambled out of bed and put on her slippers. Then, dressed only in her nightgown, she ran downstairs and went to the front door. And looking through the peephole, she saw her father's face outside. And he was staring right at her, and the doorbell just kept ringing insistently. "Okay, hold on, I'm coming," she shouted. She pulled back the deadbolt and was about to unlatch the door when she stopped. She looked through the peephole again at her father, but there was something about his expression that just wasn't quite right. His eyes were wide open. He looked terrified, so she slid the deadbolt back into place. "Dad? Did you forget your keys? Is there someone out there with you? I'm not opening this door until you say something." The doorbell just kept on ringing, but for some reason, her father just refused to answer her desperate cries. For the rest of the night, the frightened girl just cowered in the corner of the hallway, helplessly listening to the ceaseless ringing of that doorbell. And it seemed to go on for hours. Eventually, she was able to fall into an uneasy sleep. And at dawn, she woke up and realized that everything was quiet. She crept over to the door and looked through the peephole again. Her father was still there, staring at her. She cautiously opened the door and was confronted with a sight that filled her with unimaginable horror. Her father's severed head was hanging from a nail above the door. There was a note attached to the doorbell. In crude, scrawled writing, it read, "Clever girl." It was in the middle of the night, and I was in the bedroom trying to relax. I changed the channel on the TV and saw that the local news was on. At the bottom of the screen, there was a breaking news alert. Murderer on the loose, hiding in the vicinity. Police warning everyone to be on the alert. Suspect is armed and dangerous. I was just drifting off to sleep when I was awakened by a strange noise downstairs, and it sounded like there was someone in the house. And at that moment, my heart began beating fast, and I broke into a cold sweat. Straining my ears to listen, I thought I heard another noise. It was the sound of a door creaking. It wasn't my imagination. There was an intruder in the house. I have to get out of here fast, I thought. I slipped off the bed as quietly as possible and crept towards the window. My body was shaking with fear, and I was hoping I didn't make any noise. Just then, I heard faint footsteps making their way up the stairs, and it sounded like more than one person. At any second, they would burst through the door. I had to get away. I climbed out the window and onto the garage roof, moving as fast as I could without making too much noise. And at the edge of the roof, I grabbed the drain pipe and lowered myself down until I dropped into the garden. As I paused, I looked up at the window I had just escaped from. I saw the lights go on. Phew, that was close. A chill ran down my spine as I thought about what would have happened if they caught me. I made my way to the bottom of the garden and into the woods. And once I was solely hidden by the trees, I broke into a run. I pushed onwards, stumbling through the darkness and moving through the undergrowth until I came across another housing estate. Clutching my knife, I headed towards another house.